Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back with another episode of Cheap Shots. This is a series that is dedicated to showing you how to save money on the miniatures wargaming hobby. And on today's episode number 65, we're going to show you guys how to quickly as well as cheaply paint up the Scarcrag Snivelers, the Goblin Team for Games Workshop Blood Bowl. As you can see in this photo, you have a very beautiful tabletop standard when it comes to your guys' Goblin Blood team. At the same time, assuming that you purchased everything in our cheapskate method for the very first time, you're talking about a total investment of $34. And when you compare that with the same materials that you need to purchase from Army Painter and Games Workshop, you're talking about a grand total savings of $156.68. So that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's get this video on a roll. So the very first thing you need to do, of course, is to prime your miniatures. In this case, as you can see in this photo, I decided to go for a white primer. I decided to use Rust-Oleum flat white primer. I can get this at my local Walmart for $3.99, and I pretty much just give a general once over with the primer all over the miniature. Now, priming actually does two things. The first thing it does, it actually gives a very rough surface for your acrylic paint to adhere to. If you were to paint your miniatures with bare plastic without a primer with acrylic paint, what ended up happening is that the acrylic paint has nothing to adhere to really, because the plastic surface is too smooth and it would just rub right off your miniatures and of course ruin your finish. By priming your miniatures, it actually gives an uneven surface and a texture surface for the acrylic paint to adhere to, and that actually ends up with a long-lasting finish because of it. Now, another thing that primer actually does, it actually has a big impact on the overall color scheme of your miniatures as well. Traditionally speaking, whenever it comes to painting your miniatures with bright, vibrant colors, you want to use a white undercoat. If you're planning on painting your miniatures with a darker color scheme, traditionally speaking, you want to use a black undercoat, and for anything in between, you just use gray. So since we're doing a quick paint method, which means that we'll be using oil wash to paint these miniatures, it's going to darken down the colors that we use, so we want to go with really bright and vibrant colors, and that's the reason why I went with a white primer. So once you have your white primer done, next thing to do now is move on to your very first set of base coats. So the very first thing I end up working on is the flesh. So these guys are all goblins, so because of that I'm going with that green skin look, which is pretty simple. So because I put 2 thin layers of palm leaf by Apple Barrel paint, it runs you about 50 cents at your local Walmart, and all I really do real quick is just paint all the exposed flesh on these goblins. Now there's not very much exposed flesh on these miniatures because they are wearing football pads and armor and things of that nature, so you don't have to worry about it covering too much or too large of an area, but just do a really quick 2 coats on top of your miniature. You don't need to be particularly neat at this stage because you can always neat up as you add different layers onto them. And as you can see in this photo, just put 2 thin layers and you're ready to move on to a dry brush. So the next color I go for is Lime Sherbet. It's made by Apple Barrel Paint, runs you 50 cents at your local Walmart, and as you can see in this photo, I just do a quick dry brush all over the flesh of the goblins. Now to do this is pretty simple. All you need to do, of course, is to take your paintbrush and dip it into your Lime Sherbet, and then what you want to do is wipe off the excess paint onto a piece of either tissue paper or onto paper towel until you barely have any paint left on the brush. And taking that dry brush without wetting it, you then just basically brush and just dust the entire surface of your miniature. And what ends up happening is that the pigment of your paint actually captures upon the raised surfaces of the miniatures, making sure that this brighter pigment stays on the raised surfaces of the miniatures while the darker color stays in the recesses. This kind of is a really nice effect to add depth to your miniatures, so that way you catch the raised highlights and the darker color remains on the surface. Now when it comes to dry brushing, you always want to do it in layers. You always want to start off with a very light dry brush and then build up off of those layers to the desired degree of brightness that you want for your miniatures. After all, it's always easier to add more dry brushing to a miniature, but it's very difficult to take off. In fact, if you put too much dry brushing on and you don't like the end result, you basically have to repaint the miniature with the base color and then start again. So always work in layers when it comes to your dry brushing. Alright, so now that we're done with the dry brushing of the flesh, the next thing we need to work on now is on the uniform. So as you can see in this case, I decided to use Light Mocha by Apple Barrel Paint, runs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. And I'm using this color for all the trousers of the members of the team. So as you can see in this photo, I just picked those out in 2 thin layers of Light Mocha. Light Mocha is a very bright tan color, so it kind of has like this off kind of tan beige look to it, which is kind of nice. It contrasts nicely with the green skin of the goblins as well. So you can see I just picked out all the trousers that each of the goblins are wearing and picked those out in 2 thin layers. Now I do have some Novelers in here from Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and I'm using those guys as proxies for my secret weapons and killer contraption players for my Goblin team. So I just of course do things like also pick out their boots and their trousers as well. So once you put 2 thin layers of Light Mocha, you're ready to move on. Now the next color you want to use, of course, is Pavement by Apple Barrel Paint. This is a very dark gray color. It costs 50 cents at your local Walmart. And the nice thing about Pavement, it also has a little bit of a grimy kind of texture to it as well, which makes it really good color to use in order to do dry brushing with. And it's a really nice finish. I use this color all the time. Now in this case, what I decided to do is pick out the layers of different leather goods that these goblins are wearing, as well as their shirts. Each of these goblins have jerseys, so I paint those on 2 thin layers of pavement, and same thing with some of the leather goods. So things like the boots, for example, or some gloves, pretty much whatever kind of catches my eye for those black leather goods that I want to paint in black. I also use the pavement for the Blood Bowl coins for both sides of them as well. I also use them for the gloved hands of the turn, as well as reroll counter markers that are located in the middle as well. And you just put 2 thin layers of pavement, and once those 2 thin layers are done, time for you to move on for a dry brush. So now that we're done with applying the pavement to the black portions of our miniatures, the next thing I'm going to do real quick is to do a quick dry brush with Drizzle Gray by Deltum Serum Coat. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. The reason why I use this color is just because at the time I was out of light gray, so that's the reason why I used it. I have this bottle that's kind of laying around for the most part. And all I do, of course, is just a quick dry brush over all the portions that you painted in pavement. The nice thing I said about the pavement paint, the pavement does have a little bit of gritty texture to it, so because of that, it will catch nicely with the dry brushing and give you a really nice finish as well. Now, like I said before, you want to work in layers when it comes to dry brushing. In this case, I just put a very light dry coat on all the pavement portions that I did, just because I want a little bit more of a subtle effect. I didn't want to really overpower the black color with layers of additional light gray. So you, of course, can bring it to whatever degree of lightness that you want, and once you're satisfied with your dry brushing, time to move on to some more base coats. So the next color, of course, I use is Burnt Umber by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. And the reason why I use this color is for some more of the leather goods that are on these miniatures. So for example, a lot of these guys are actually wearing these gloves on their hands as well as wrist guards. So for some of the miniatures, I decided to pick out those leather goods in 2 thin layers of Burnt Umber as well, just to add some color variety to the miniatures. The reason why you want to do this is because Games Workshop, when they made their sculpts for Blood Bowl, pretty much you have 6 sculpts per team for the most part, and what they do is they basically double those sculpts. So pretty much the players have similar poses for the most part. The only way you really can change some variety of these miniatures is by changing things like the heads for the most part. So in order to fool the eye of a person looking at your Blood Bowl team, to make it look like it's much more diverse in terms of the sculpts that are actually present, I believe really strongly in using alternating colors and different colors to kind of create that illusion of variety, and that's the reason why I picked those layers out in Burnt Umber. And now that we're done with the Burnt Umber for the leather goods of some of the miniatures, the next thing to do now, of course, is a dry brush. In this case, I use Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. And all I do real quick is a quick dry brush for all the brown leather goods that I painted up as well. I did forget to mention, I also painted the handles of the turn markers in the back with Burnt Umber, and then I dry brushed that with Territorial Beige as well. And once you brighten up your miniature to the degree of brightness that you want for your dry brushing, time to move on now to the smaller details. Now the next thing we move on to, of course, is by using Taupe Gray by Anita's Acrylic. It runs you about 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. It's a nice kind of off gray, kind of tannish color that I like to use, and it actually contrasts very nicely to the light mocha that we use for the pants of the miniatures, as well as for the black of the jerseys. In this case, I'm using this for all the straps on the goblins as well. The goblins actually have quite a bit of belts and straps crisscrossing their body and holding the armor panels into place as well. They also have them for their buckles of their wrist guards, as well as the little bits of stitching on the gauntlets of the turn markers as well. And all I do, of course, I just pick out those 2 details in 2 thin layers of Taupe Gray. And as you can see, it contrasts very nicely with the black of the jerseys, and at the same time it's also a strong contrasting color for the light mocha that we use for the trousers. So now that we're done with those details, the next thing to do now is to paint up the armor panels. So when it comes to the armor panels, I kept with the traditional yellow paint job of the Scarcrag Snivelers, and as you can see in this photo, it is the most predominant color that you see on this team. Now originally, like I said before, Games Workshop actually gives you only 6 real sculpts for your teams, and it basically doubles it. So to add some variety to the diversity of your miniatures and for your teams, I suggest that you use different shades of colors in order to differentiate different players, so that way it kind of creates this variety of different colors in your team and gives you the illusion that there are multiple sculpts that make up your team as well. Now traditionally what I like to do, I like to use 2 different shades of the same color for the armor of a Blood Bowl team to add that variety. And this is where I kind of made my mistake. And the reason why is because the King's Gold that I use for half the team and the normal yellow that I use for the other half of the team, both those products are made by Apple Barrel Paint. They cost 50 cents a piece. You can get them at your local Walmart. The problem though is when I painted them, after I got done, I realized that the differences between the King's Gold as well as the yellow in terms of color brightness was very, very, very subtle, to the point where you can almost not tell a difference between the two colors. So because of that, I recommend you go with a much stronger difference in color if you decide to do it. Either go with a brighter yellow or a darker yellow, maybe a strong mustard yellow maybe in some cases. But I didn't do that. The differences between these two colors is not different enough, so because of that, they look exactly the same. But here's a trade-off. The trade-off is that these colors are so cheap, in fact, you could actually make a mistake like this and it's not going to cost you anything really. It's just going to cost you 50 cents, all it's going to do. So don't worry about that. If you're using something from Army Painter or from Games Workshop, it could cost you anywhere between $5 to $7, which is quite substantial. As opposed to 50 cents, it's a negligible mistake at best. So my suggestion to you, whatever color yellow you want, put 2 thin layers on all the armor panels and you're ready to move on to a dry brush. So regardless of what color I use for the yellow, I did do an all over dry brush with exactly the same color. I used Canary Yellow by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart, and as you can see in this photo, I just did a really quick dry brush over all the yellow armor panels on the Scarcrag Snivelers. I also used exactly the same dry brushing on the little turn markers for the little crescent moon icons that those turn markers are holding. I also do exactly the same thing with the coins. You can kind of see in the background there where I basically put I just did a dry brushing with the yellow, with Canary Yellow on that one for the crescent moon icon on the other side of the coin. And like I said before, dry brushing is a beautiful way to add some depth to your miniatures as well. It's a nice pastel color. Now I will admit, if you notice, these miniatures do have very much a chalky kind of pastel finish done with them because of all the dry brushing we're doing. Don't worry about that. If that texture throws you off, when we get to the oil washing stage, that's going to solve all of your problems. So don't worry, trust in the process, because trust me, it works. Alright, so now that we got all the yellow paint on the miniatures, the next thing we need to do now is add our accent colors for the armor. In this case, as you can see, I just used straight up black acrylic paint. I believe this one's made by Apple Barrel Paint. Costs you about 50 cents at your local Walmart. And all I did is I just added some variety to my miniatures by adding different armor panels and painting them straight black. Traditionally speaking, whenever you paint alternating colors like this on any kind of color scheme, it's always best to start off with a light color to do the actual base work, and then you can create your alternating color with the darker color as well, because traditionally speaking, darker colors do a better job of hiding the lighter color beneath than if you did it the other way. So because of that, you always want to start off light and then move on to dark with your alternating colors. And so like I said before, to add some variety to the miniature sculpts, what I like to do is I like to alternate some of the colors, so that way it creates the mind's eye, it fools the mind's eye, and I think there's a lot more variety in the miniatures as well. So for example, as you can see, I have like some of these Scarcrag Snivelers, their left arm shoulder pad is painted in black, while their exact same sculpt would have it on the right hand side. Or some things like I take out some knee pads or some elbow pads or a helmet crest or an entire armor piece. Whatever the case may be, I like to alternate this black color to add some variety to the miniatures. And this black color is a very nice dark black, so you can probably get away with 1 layer if you're actually pretty careful with your application of the paint. I put 2 layers on just to be extra careful. So as you can see here now, it's added some nice variety of the overall look of the Scarcrag Snivelers. So now that we're done, the next thing to do, of course, is another dry brush. In this case, I use Anita's Acrylic Gray, just a normal 65-cent tube of gray paint from your local Hobby Lobby. I really like the way that this paint works, especially when it comes to dry brushing. And what I do is I just do a really faint dry brushing on all the black armor panels that I just paint on these miniatures as well. And like I said, the black stays in the recesses. It adds kind of like this weathering kind of look to the black armor with the dry brushing, and it just looks really, really nice as well. And as you can see, a majority of these miniatures are now finally painted. So now with most of the armor painted and most of the miniatures painted, now we can start working on the fun little details on the miniatures. So the next color that we use, of course, is another base coat. This time I use Anita's Acrylic True Red, and as you can see in this picture, I pinned out all of the eyes on the miniatures as well. So all the eyes of the goblins, as well as the moon icons on the coins, as well as the moon icons on the turn markers as well. I just pick out those details in 2 thin layers of True Red and just put a single dot of this stuff on the eyes. Now, I can't gush enough about Anita's Acrylic True Red paint. It is basically it's essentially the best red paint I've used in terms of craft paints. It's got a very nice, vibrant color. It goes on very easily. You don't have to worry about freaking out by adding multiple layers to get that really strong red finish. The pigment is awesome on it. It does a really good job, especially if you're trying to hide mistakes or adding in layers. I just can't say enough good things about that True Red paint. It's one of my favorite paints that I use in my entire collection. And the best part is it only costs 65 cents, which is absolutely amazing. If you have doubts about using red paints, grab yourself a tube of this stuff and trust me, it's going to change your life when it comes to painting cheaply with using the color red. Now, the last few details I'm going to pick out before we move on to our italics are things like the teeth, as well as some of the little icons that you have going on throughout the entirety of the miniatures as well. Some things like, we also need to pick out some things like blood, for example. Also pick out some things like snot and that kind of stuff. It's actually kind of funny to say that, but these are the things that we're kind of picking out for the most part. So the things that we're picking out, for example, are things like the teeth and the claws, for example. Some of these goblins have fangs being bared, in which case I picked those out in 2 thin layers of khaki paint by Apple Roll Paint. Runs to 50 cents at your local Walmart. Now, some of these goblins, when they're running around, they actually have their tongues sticking out as they're running around as well. So because of that, I pick out that detail in 2 thin layers of bright magenta. Also runs you 50 cents at your local Walmart as well. So I just find the ones whose tongues are sticking out of their mouth, and I just add 2 thin layers of that. And the last thing I do, of course, I look for any goblin players who have any snot that's dribbling out of their nose. These guys have some really big nose on their these sculpts, and some of them actually have like snot dribbling out of it. In which case, I picked out 2 thin layers of Kiwi by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a very bright and vibrant lime green, almost a neon day glow green kind of color, and it works perfectly and contrasts nicely against the skin of the goblins. And once you're done picking out those fine details, time for us to move on to the metallics. Alright, so the next thing to do now is start working on the metallics. In this case, I use 2 colors, both made by Folk Art. They're both made from Folk Art's metallic line. I use copper as well as gunmetal gray. Both these products are only 75 cents at your local Walmart or Hobby Lobby, and they do a wonderful job. Now for the copper, what I used that was to pick out the details of the face grills on each of their football helmets. Now, not all of these miniatures are wearing football helmets, but the ones that do have these really bright colored grills crossing their faces, and I picked out 2 thin layers of the copper color because it contrasts nicely with the black and the yellow of the armor. At the same time, for the major colors that you actually use for most of this, actually gunmetal gray by Folk Art. It's a nice, beautiful dark steel gray color, and I use it for everything. Things like armor panels, the crests of the helmets, the spikes of their punch daggers, the blades of their weaponry, the edges of their armors, the buckles that they have on their belts. At the same time, I also use this color on the spikes as well as the armor panels that are located on the turn markers in the back. I also use it to rim the bases, rim the edges of the Blood Bowl coins as well as pick them out in the Blood Bowl emblem. So as you can see, there's put 2 thin layers of that gunmetal gray as well as that copper, and you're pretty much done with these miniatures, and you now need to move on to your oil wash. So the next step, of course, is an oil wash. And like I said earlier, this is a quick paint method, which means we'll be using oil washing to pretty much bring out the last remaining details on the miniature. Now, traditionally, whenever you use a quick paint, what you use is you use an oil wash, and the oil wash seeps into the recesses of the miniature by adding some more depth and 3-dimensionality to your miniature. At the same time, the oil wash will also smooth out the transitions between your layers of base coats as well as dry brushes, and that passy chalky-like finish that we had earlier, basically it's smoothed out by the oil wash as well. And at the same time, because we're using oil wash, as you can see, it really darkened down the bright colors that we use to paint up the miniatures, and that's the reason why we use such bright colors to begin with, as well as a white undercoat, because the oil wash is going to mute it down. Now, traditionally speaking, you could use Armor Painter Strong Tone. That is a product that many wargamers and miniatures painters use. As an excellent product, it does exactly as advertised. The only problem, though, is that it costs $32 a can, whereas Midwax Poly Shades Mission Note Color you can buy at a Walmart for about $7.50, and it does exactly the same thing, and that's exactly what I like to use for this one. So I take my Poly Shades, I paint it all over my miniatures, treat it like basically like a wash, and as you can see, that the oil wash does a really good job of smoothing out those transitions, darkening those detailed colors, and also seeping into the recesses as well. Now, your Midwax Poly Shades is a mixture of stain as well as polyurethane, so the stain is what actually gives it the color that you're looking for. At the same time, the polyurethane will dry and cure, and what it does, it will actually put a clear coat of protectant all over the entirety of your miniature as well. And that's the reason why you want to wait 24 hours for this stuff to dry. And the reason why is because you're letting for this polyurethane to cure. The last thing you want to do, of course, is to handle these miniatures while they're still wet and tacky, because you could actually strip off base coats of paint off of the miniature and absolutely ruin your finish. So my suggestion to you is to use this step as the very last step of your painting process of whenever you paint. Wait 24 hours until the next day until we get back to painting your miniatures again, and then pick it from there. Now, you will have a very bright, shiny sheen on your miniatures when you get done. That's because of the polyurethane. If you don't like that candy coating, I suggest you buy a can of matte varnish. I like to use Krylon. It costs you about $5.99 at your local Walmart. Just give it the once over that matte varnish. It puts away and mattes down that shine. But if you like that candy coating look, you can totally skip that step. As you can see in this photo, I decided to use that matte varnish to matte down that sheen on the miniatures, so I just do that really quickly. And now that we're done with those miniatures, the next thing to do now is the bases. So in this case, I'm kind of going for like this mountainous kind of highland look for my bases. So because of that, I'm going to go with a darker tone for my bases. Now, if you're wondering what the texture I use for my base, I just use sand as well as wood glue to create this look. What I do is I paint the bases with just straight up wood glue, and then I dust it with sand that I get from my backyard. And then after that, I wash it with a mixture, 50-50 mixture of wood glue as well as water. When you mix the mixture together, it should be about the consistency of milk. And what you do is you just wash the base with that, and what it does when it dries, that wood glue makes a nice sealant for your base work. Now, after you get that done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a single layer of pavement by Apple Barrel paint in order to paint these bases. And as you can see, the white undercoat from the primer is peeking through, and that is perfectly fine because we're going to dry brush these bases with a lighter gray anyways, so it's no harm, no foul involved. Just put your single layer of pavement on and move on to your dry brush. So the next thing I do, of course, is that I do a quick dry brush of the pavement paint that I just added to the bases of my miniatures. In this case, I use Folk Arts Pale Gray, and as you can see there, I decided to go to my local Hobby Lobby to buy another two just because I didn't care for the drizzle gray too much, and that's the reason why I went by and used my Pale Gray. It costs you about 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby, and once again, just doing a quick dry brush all over the entirety of the miniature. As you can see, that light gray, pale gray pretty much captures the raised surfaces of all the texture on the bases while leaving that darker pavement color in the recesses. And then once you're done doing that, next thing you do now is to do some flocking. So the next thing you need to do, of course, is to do some flocking with your miniatures. To do flocking is really simple. All you gotta do is just put some wood glue onto your bases that you want to be covered in grass and just dust it with flocking. Now, flocking, of course, can be purchased by many game manufacturers all over the country. Army Painter, Games Workshop, whatever, you could use whatever you like. Me, though, I use homemade flocking. My buddy Iron Major, who's the guy who makes all the terrain on our channel, he actually makes a lot of homemade flock for himself. He primarily uses sawdust is what he does. There's a buddy of ours that actually owns a wood shop, and he actually does a lot of custom cabinetry making and woodworking for a lot of people in the area that we live in, and he's got mountains of sawdust from his wood shop. So every single time we want to borrow some, we just go to his place, we just take a couple of Ziploc bags full of sawdust, we bring it back home. Iron Major then takes the stuff and refines it by sifting it, and then what he does, he mixes it with different shades of green from acrylic paints and mixes together, lets it dry up, and then he crumbles it back down to flocking again. So because of that, we have tons of flocking for days, and that's exactly what I used here. I just use that homemade flock to dust my miniatures, and we're ready to move on from there. Or if you don't have access to homemade flock or you don't know how to make it, there's plenty of tutorials on YouTube that you can watch to help you guys make that stuff. Or if you have the money, you can go out and buy it if you like. And the very last step that we need to do now, of course, is to rim the bases. So in this case, I once again use palm leaf, which is the very same color I used for the flesh of all the goblin players that I had. And I just put 2 thin layers of palm leaf all over the rims of the bases. So that way, as you can see, it's got a wonderful finish for the miniatures. And this is exactly what your Scarcrag Snivelers will look like when you are done. Now, granted, I did some extra painting with the different little novelers that I have that I'm using for my special players with their secret weapons. And at the same time, I also paint up 2 Blood Bowl trolls in the background because I'm planning on using this for my team. And as you can see, it's a beautiful tabletop finish with a very minimum very minimum amount of money needed in order to purchase the materials that you need to have. And it looks absolutely fantastic and ready to bring pain and glory onto the gridiron of the Blood Bowl. So now that we're done talking about exactly how to paint these guys up, let's go ahead and talk about what you will need to purchase from both Citadel as well as Army Painter to do exactly the same thing we did, and talk about the total cost as well as the savings involved. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about the Citadel and Army Painter method. If you were to purchase everything on this list from Citadel and Army Painter for the very first time, this is what you will need to purchase in order to paint up your miniatures exactly the same way we did by using those name brand paints. First of all, you need to buy a can of Corax White Spray for $17 by Citadel to do your priming. And then you need to paint up your miniatures in Militarum Green, which costs you $4.55. You'll then need to dry brush them with Cyberite Green, which runs you $4.55 for that one as well. Next, you'll need to work on their pants, which you'll need to buy a pot of Baneblade Brown, which runs you $4.55. And as for their armor, as for their jerseys, you'll need to buy Eshin Gray for $4.55 and dry brush it with Ulthuan Gray for another $4.55. After that, for their brown leather goods, you need to paint that in 2 thin layers of Wildwood, which will be $7.08 for that color, and then dry brush them with Baylor Brown, which costs you $4.55. Now, for all the belts and straps on the miniatures, you'll need to buy a pot of Rakarth Flesh, which runs you $4.55 for that. And for the armor for these guys, you'll need to buy Averland Sunset as well as Ionden Yellow. Averland Sunset runs you $4.55, while Ionden Yellow runs you $7.80 after that. Next, you'll need to dry brush them with Hexos Pale Sun, which is $4.55 for that color. Now for the alternating black color for the armor panels, you need to buy a pot of Abandoned Black and then dry brush them with Slanesh Gray, both of which cost you $4.55 for those. You'll then need to pick out the eyes and 2 thin layers of Mephiston Red, which runs you $4.55 for that color. You'll need to pick out their teeth and fangs with Morghast Bone. You'll need to pick out their tongues in Screamer Pink, and then finally pick out the details of all the snot dripping from their noses with Moot Green, and all 3 of those colors run you $4.55 for those. Now for the metallics, you'll need to buy a pot of Screaming Bell for all the copper colors you'll use for the face masks of their helmets, and then you also need to buy a pot of Lead Belcher for all the silver elements, which are just $7.80 for those 2 colors a piece. And since we're doing a quick paint method, you'll need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone, which is $32 for that item. And then if you decide to spray your miniatures down with a matte finish, you'll need to buy a can of Minotaur Varnish from Citadel, which is $19.50 for that. And then lastly, the last thing to do for the bases, of course, you'll need to pick out those colors. Once again, Eshin Gray and Ulthuan Gray, and then dry brush with Ulthuan Gray. And then of course, if you want to add flocking, the cheapest flock I could find was made by Army Painter. It's called the Flocking Basing Set. Runs at $18.99 for that. Now, assuming you're purchasing everything from Citadel and Army Painter for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $191.49. Now, when you compare that with the Cheapskate method, which costs you $32.81, you're talking about a grand total savings of $157.68 being saved. So there you go. This is how we painted up the Scarcrag Snivelers for our studio's Blood Bowl League, and it showed you exactly how we went about doing it and painting these guys for about $34 in total. So that's good news from you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest, greatest hobby news related to our channel. That's good for this one, guys. We'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.